and then he makes this one stumble. He makes this one mistake, and for that to cost him the entrance to the promised land just seems so harsh. Of course, we talked through it last week. I think at least one thing to understand off of that is, Moses was the leader. Moses was the one that God was counting on to show the people the example, and to show them, to lead them in the direction they're supposed to go. And when you see him disobeying God here, and obviously we talked about last week, it's more than just disobedience. Yes, he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, but when God pronounces judgment, you can see in verse 12, the problem. God doesn't say, well, I told you to speak to it and you struck it. That is true. That was a problem. But when God puts his finger on the problem, he says, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people. That was the issue. That was the issue. You didn't believe me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people. There's a depth here that I really feel like is worth meditating on. So again, I'll just kind of plant the seed, and we can talk about it some more if everyone wants to. But if you just think about sin, a lot of times in our minds, sin is just, oh, I didn't follow God's law. Oops, he told me to do this. He told me to do X, and I did Y. I didn't dot the I. I didn't cross the T. That we think about sin as just being that. But it's so much more than that. Sin is you didn't believe him enough to obey him. If you don't believe him enough to obey him, you're not treating him as holy. You're not treating him as holy. And so disobedience equates to disbelief, lack of belief, weak faith. Disobedience equates to, when you connect it in the language of Hebrews 3 and Hebrews 4, it equates to rebellion. It's not a small thing in God's eyes. And that's what I think is one thing worth reflecting on. And the other in this story is because Moses was a teacher, Moses was a leader, Moses was one who people looked up to. God was holding him to a higher standard. He was, and maybe that's not even the right way to say. Maybe it's not the higher standard, but he fell under stricter judgment. That's the language of James, when James says, "Be not many of you teachers, knowing that you will incur a stricter judgment." There's a stricter judgment for people who should know the law and are supposed to be instructors of the law. Like in Hebrews 5, where he tells those Christians in Hebrews 5, by this time you ought to be teachers, but you have need again to be taught again the elementary things. He's not okay with the fact that they haven't grown into teachers. He's shaming them for not growing into teachers. That's as Christians, that's what we're all supposed to be. We're all supposed to be maturing to the point where we can be teachers. We can be people who lead others to Christ. And so when we sin, especially when we sin in a public way, it's ugly. It's so ugly. And it brings that black eye to God. It puts that black eye on the church, and it can really hurt the cause of Christ. It could keep some soul from the Lord. And I think that's part of what's happening here. Why God is so harsh with Moses. He needs to be, so the people can see again how serious sin is. He's constantly telling them this. Yes, ma'am.
Just like unbelievers. And it's a scary thing because there's where the sinners are.
Yep.
And I think that's what Moses did right here. He had a moment of unbelief, and he sinned. And the consequences don't go away because you're sinning.
That's right. Yeah, good thoughts. Yeah. Thessalonians, Paul tells us he's going to come in flaming fire. He's going to deal out retribution to those who don't believe and to those who don't obey.
And God had already made the promise that they weren't going to go in. All those other people weren't going to go in. So he had, I guess he knew what was coming.
Oh, for sure.
Moses didn't obey.
For sure. Real quick, before we move on past this, go over to Deuteronomy for a second. There's several passages that mention this sin and kind of reflect back on it. I just want to look at these two. I put them up on the board to make sure I wouldn't forget. Chapter 1, verse 37. This is where Moses is actually in the middle of, in this section, he is recounting why they weren't able to enter the promised land the first time. And it's in the middle of that, which obviously they weren't able to enter because of their sin. That was their problem. But in the middle of that, in verse 37, he says, even with me, the Lord was angry on your account and said, you shall not go up in there. So this is Moses, in Moses' word, his read of the situation, saying, God was angry with me on your account, because of you. And you can see it also in chapter 3. And I wanted to read this because this is really powerful to me. Chapter 3, let's just read this section here, beginning in verse 23. And I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have only begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Please let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me because of you and would not listen to me. And the Lord said, enough from you. Do not speak to me of this matter again. So at least a couple of pretty powerful thoughts from that, which you don't really get as much from the Numbers account. One, again, this language of God was angry with me on your account. And I think obviously God was angry with Moses because of what Moses did. But if you remember, the situation he was in was because the people were complaining again. The people, were again murmuring. So Moses is correct to say, hey, this is at least partly on you guys, at least partly your fault. But it does feel that way. It does feel that way. I think if you just recognize what he's doing in Deuteronomy, he's giving them his parting address. He's telling them what they need to know. They need to know that a lot of this was on them. A lot of this was, now his punishment fell on him. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about their part of it. But you had your...
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I think the way we have to look at this is it was compounded by, God was already angry with the children. He told us, speak to the rock, and it was compounded. So what Moses did was set an example at that moment. If God didn't find worthy, and it cost him as well. So he was still responsible for his sin.
For sure. And I do think we find ourselves in this situation quite often. I could think of several personal examples where maybe anger got the better of me, or I made the wrong choice and didn't respond as I should. I can think of 100 examples where I wish I would have dealt with that differently. And then I think back but I was only dealing with that situation because of what they did. If they hadn't have done this, if they hadn't have done that, then I wouldn't have even been in that situation. It's like, okay, true, but you still shouldn't have done that. You still shouldn't have done that. And especially when you think about things as we must, from the perspective of God controlling all things. God will never allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able. Yes, they shouldn't have done that, but that doesn't excuse you for what you did later. That's how we need to recognize it. That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Ability that he has too.
Yes. I forget whose comment it was last week, but when God tells Moses to speak to the rock, he had an opportunity. He had an opportunity to give glory to God, and so it's more than just you disobeyed. It's you missed this opportunity to give glory to me. He could have been that teacher in that moment, and again. I think we need to see ourselves in that. We've got to see ourselves in that. Is we have opportunities all the time because we live in a sinful world and we're surrounded by sinful people doing sinful things. And those things that we observe give us opportunities. They give us opportunities to speak God's glory, to teach people. And instead, a lot of times we vent our anger, our frustration, we make the same mistake Moses did. I think it's really powerful. So then the other thought from this section that I just read in Deuteronomy 3 is think about the emotion of Moses' pleading with the Lord here. Because you don't read that in Numbers 20. You don't see that. He said, I pleaded with the Lord. I pleaded with the Lord. Like, what are you hearing from that? Is in Numbers is just telling a story, but here you get the emotions. Is this was no small thing for Moses not to be able to enter the promised land? That was no small thing to him. He'd been working for that. He'd been really working for that, and he pleads with the Lord, and God basically says to him the same thing he said to Paul. My grace is sufficient for you. Deal with it. Basically, and this is Moses dealing with consequences of his own actions. We've made that point. Just because you're forgiven, just because God can redeem you, doesn't mean the consequences of sin go away. And look what God says there in verse 26. Enough from you. Enough from you. Do not speak to me of this matter again. To me, it. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. All right. You've asked 3 times now. If you ask again, there's going to be a problem. Yeah. Again, just thinking about the emotions of that exchange that God has with Moses is so powerful. Moses is pleading with him. That's one thing, but now the punishment is what it's going to be. You need to stop. You need to deal with it. And again, I think for ourselves to think about, when we're dealing with consequences of our own sin, there's nothing wrong with asking, for relief, asking for God to address this or that. But at some point, you just have to learn to live with it. At some point, you've got to learn to make the best of the situation, make the best of the bed that you've made, so to speak. Like I say, there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to meditate on. And you go back to Numbers, there where we were reading about it. Numbers 20. It's just a few verses here, just a few verses. And always the Bible amazes me, where you have just this little short story, and it seems so straightforward. But then the more you scratch the surface, the more you see, the more you meditate on it, the more there is to get from it. It's just awesome. The Bible is awesome. Any other thoughts, comments about that? I feel like we could probably keep going with that if we wanted to. If you have another thought about it, don't feel bad about bringing us back to it.
No matter what.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what we think. He's over everything.
That's right.
I just want to say, I think it was just a good comment that you made, that sometimes when you're dealing with the consequences of your sin, that it is important to remember you can still pray and ask for God to encourage you, because sometimes you get into the situation where your consequences are so devastating that can lead you to a different kind of sin if you're not careful. So you need to have that, still have to have the relationship and remember to ask for, please help me, strengthen me to deal with the fallout of whatever I've done.
Absolutely. And if God could grant relief, that would be wonderful. He's going to be right in whatever he does, but it's our job to deal with the answer. If he takes something away, thank you, Lord. If he doesn't, I understand. I'm going to do the best I can. We bring up Judas a lot. I think Judas is worth thinking about in that vein. I believe Judas could have had forgiveness if he had sought it in the right way. But the consequences of his actions were more than he was willing to deal with. I'm not going to say more than he could have dealt with. I don't think God gave him more than he could bear. But they were more than he was willing to deal with, and he gave up. And that's the thing we cannot do. We cannot give up. I think if Judas had sought relief from those consequences in the proper way, God would have given him enough relief for him to be able to deal with it. You know? But no, it's a great point, Andrew. Absolutely. All right, moving forward to some of these next stories. I'm not planning to read the whole story in the auditorium. I'm hoping, as I've said, that we'll kind of have already read it and we can kind of just skim it together and bring some thoughts out. So in this section here, you see them interacting with Edom, the Edomites. And again, let me switch maps here. So this is a map that shows this new entrance, whereas this map shows where they were originally from Kadesh Barnea trying to go that way, but they end up going around. So this is just a more detailed version of what's about to happen. So they send messages ahead to the Edomites. What's their approach? Like, how are they approaching the Edomites? As friends, as hostiles? What's
First, God's told them not taking care of the brethren.
okay?
Which is to notify them, we would like to pass through. Now, did they respond the way Israel would want it? No. Probably not the way that God would want it, but they would treat them as brethren.
Yeah. So God has given them that instruction that the Edomites are to be treated as brethren. They make this offer. Let us pass through your land. Let us pass through your land. We won't take anything. We won't mess it. We'll stay on the highway. Just let us pass through your land. And as Darren kind of goes ahead to the next point, Edom doesn't respond. Edom does not respond properly. They, well, I say properly, like you said, as the Lord would want it. I think that was a good way to say that. And he threatened. He said, "I'll come out with a sword to you." So, Israel has a choice. We're going to see later, similarly, or the events unfold similarly, except Israel just goes to war with them. In this case, with the Edomites, to Darren's point, they say, "Okay, well, we'll go around." And then they even make a counter offer. It's like, verse 19, if we drink your water, our livestock drinks, we'll pay for it. We'll pay. We'll make you whole. And even that wasn't for Edom. They do reference, if you read in the beginning, they reference the fact that the Edomites should have known about Israel's plight, the Israelites' plight in Egypt. That we went down into Egypt. That we suffered many hardships there. They've almost certainly been hearing of the Exodus and what's been going on with that. And never offered help, never anything. They're just sitting in their land waiting, wondering what's going to happen, which is kind of interesting. But they appeal to Edom on those grounds. Does that remind us of anything from the history of these two peoples?
When Jacob returned and he was worried about Esau coming out to attack him.
That's right.
And he brings all the gifts and,
Yeah.
tries to appease him in order to make the best possible impression before they meet.
It's a really interesting story because Jacob knows that he's done Esau wrong, and a lot of years has passed, but he doesn't know how Esau's going to react. So he sends these emissaries ahead with these rich gifts to Esau, trying to make peace. And the indication is that Esau always was ready for peace. At that point, he was ready to welcome back his brother, and shows no animosity at all that we can tell. Of course, this is fast forward 400 years, and this is a completely different response. We're going to see the Edomites basically always being against Israel. They're never happy for Israel. They're never they never really become friends at all.
And that's part of the prophecy that maybe the younger would, older would serve the younger.
That's right. If you remember even back further, when Jacob takes the blessing, that's exactly right. Yep. So I guess from this, not a lot as far as our study with Moses, other than to just note the interaction and that they are going around Edom. They're traveling around Edom at this time. So then at the end of chapter 20, we have the death of Aaron. So this has been something that's been known that it was going to happen. Didn't know when it was going to happen. But this is, as you read the story, it doesn't take them by surprise. God tells him to go up on this mountain, and Aaron will be gathered to his people. Aaron will die. And he tells him the reason is the rebellion at the waters of Meribah, the same sin that we saw from earlier in this chapter. Again, we're losing, we have no way of knowing how much time is passing between these things. I think probably between verse 10 and now verse 22, some time has passed, but we don't know how much. So the way that Aaron passes, the way that this goes down, he goes up on the mountain, they take off his priestly attire, and they put his priestly attire on his son, and then Aaron, in that condition, passes away, he perishes. It's just interesting to think about, to note. I'm not sure what all to say about it. You can see at the end in verse 29, when they come down the mountain without Aaron, the people take a period of mourning, 30 days mourning for Aaron. But again, just like with Miriam, just to note how emotional this would have been on Moses, to be there in that moment, knowing, this is what's about to happen. And similarly, it's similar to what happens to Moses here.
And it's interesting in verse 24, towards the end of it, God is telling Moses that Aaron's not going to be able to enter the land, and he's going to die because of Moses' sin the last time they're at the water. So I think I would also add an additional layer of emotional, because it's where Moses sinned they're going back to. So I think that reminds Moses of his sin and his responsibility of it, but also passes along the consequence to Aaron as well. So I think there's a lot of emotion that's packed in here.
That's an interesting comment, Caleb. I guess I was reading verse 24 as like, you sinned, as in Moses and Aaron sinned, and you're reading it more like it was Moses' sin, which, when you read that story, it is Moses striking the rock instead of speaking to it. So it is very personal to Moses. So you might be really onto something there. But regardless, I think Moses would have felt the loss of this for sure. But no, that's an interesting thought.
One other thing to notice, I think later in Numbers, it tells you that Aaron dies in the 40th year in the 5th month. And at the beginning of chapter 20, it says of Miriam that she died in the 1st month. So I get the idea that God is winding things down of this wilderness wandering. He's later, we're going to see Joshua being appointed. He's putting things in place for the next stage in their story.
That's right. That's what we're going to hear in the next chapter. So where did you hear the 40th year? Where did you read it?
So in Numbers 33 and verse 38, it says, Aaron the priest went up to Mount Hor and died there in the 40th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt on the 1st day of the 5th month.
I had missed that. That's awesome. Yeah. That gives us a much clearer time frame. So it's very much at the end of the wandering, and also connects these two deaths within a few months. So the sin would have happened in the middle there. I appreciate that. I had missed that.
Still a period of time, like you said.
That's right.
Days, not moments.
That's right. That's right. Yep. Good thoughts. Good thoughts. Good connections. Any other comments about the death of Aaron? I guess in that same chapter, 33, we see Aaron was 123 years old, and we know Moses was 120. It kind of reminds us of how close in age they were.
throwing the babies in the river. He and Miriam was older.
That's right.
He didn't get thrown in the river.
That's right. All right. For the rest of our time, we're just going to kind of walk through the next kind of timeline, the next few events. As I said, I guess the bronze serpent event was handled, or as far as our workbook is concerned, back in lesson 13, but we haven't talked about it yet. I wanted to talk about it in sequential order. So we're just going to see how far we can get in chapter 21, and then I'll give you your marching orders for moving forward. So the beginning of chapter 21, we see the Canaanite king coming out. I said he lived in the Negev, that's the southern area there. Canaanites were obviously people that the Israelites were coming for. I mean, they were coming for them. So this is one of the first battles. They did have an earlier battle, that took place before the wanderings, but this is really going to start a sequence of battles leading up to the entrance to the Promised Land, obviously. But let me put the map up. Somewhere along here, we start reading about these battles taking place. He's going to give us a lot of locations here in just a moment. I may just leave the map up for now. So they came against Israel. They took some captives. Israel says, if you will give this people into my hand, we will devote their cities to destruction, which was part of the plan. That was part of the plan anyway, was to devote their cities to destruction. And God gives them the victory on this occasion. We've made this point before, but a lot of times you see God's people asking for, praying for things that God has already promised them. And in some ways it may seem a little bit academic or pointless, but I think that's part of what we're trying to do in praying according to the will of the Lord, is trying to get on the same page with him. Try to get on the same page and think about, what does he want for me in my life, and pray for those things. And we're not always going to be right about that, but that's what we're trying to do, is pray according to the will of the Lord. This is just a little example of that, I guess. So then this next story set out from Mount Hor, obviously where Aaron passed away, going around Edom. The people became impatient on the way. The people spoke against God and against Moses. We've been pointing out that when they complain at different times, the complaints are against, they're specifically against certain ones. Since they failed to enter the promise, since Aaron's rebellion, all of the complaints have been against Moses and against Aaron, against Moses and against Aaron, against Moses and against Aaron. But now Aaron's not there anymore, and they complain against God and against Moses. Which the point we've been making, that I think we've all been on the same page of. But several of the complaints, they're pretending, they're positioning as if they're complaining against Moses, but ultimately they really are complaining against God. So at least they put it together at this point. They're complaining against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us into Egypt, or out of Egypt, to die in this wilderness? There's no food, there's no water. Similar complaint. The water we just saw back in the last chapter, which, based on that 40th year, that verse that Jane helped me connect, there's not much passage of time between what happens in the beginning of chapter 20 and then now 21. I mean, this is very closely related. So some of the comments that we made last week, where you're dealing with another generation. This is the generation. Most of the generation that was of age when they came out of Egypt has already passed away. This is a new generation with new but the same complaints, and they've already seen water come out of a rock, and here they go again. Here they go again complaining. Well, that's what my next question was. They said there is no food, and we loathe this worthless food. I guess everybody's felt that, right? You go to the refrigerator and you pop it open. It's like, it's full, but you don't want any of it. they had been eating that manna for 40 years. I mean, he'd been giving them that manna for 40 years. There was nutritional value in it. It had been sustaining them, but they're tired of it. They're tired of it. I think we can all kind of understand where they're coming from on that, and yet, how ungrateful. How ungrateful. Here God has been providing for you. He's been taking care of you, and He could do anything that He wants to do. You could approach Him in a very different way and just, hey, can we maybe have a menu change tonight? Can we do something different? But that's not the way they approach Him. They approach Him in this, whiny, complaining, ungrateful way. Joan mentioned, comparing that to our children, dealing with little children. We see if our kids come to us in that whiny, complainy voice, well, you're going to get a different dad than if you come with, sure, appreciate what you've been doing. Do you think maybe we could do something different tonight? Now they're coming in a much more gracious approach, even an appreciative approach, as long as it's not manipulative. I don't know how God would have responded, because they never try that. They never try that.
Said, Lord, I'm so sick of these potatoes and beans. Where's my steak?
Yeah. It's worthless food. Yeah. It's comical and sad all at the same time. And then about the time you start thinking, well, how could they do that? You realize, well, we do that all the time. That's the same. And anytime these complaints come up, that's the same thoughts that I kind of go through. On this occasion, God sends fiery serpents among the people. And I've got to be honest, until Terry's lesson Wednesday, I guess I had always thought of these guys as serpents of fire. Anybody else? Is that, like Terry made the point Wednesday that word fiery basically can just mean stinging. Like it stings. It stings when they bite, kind of thing. So it may just be referring to the pain of their bite. It might be all that it's referring to. I don't know how much to make of that, but I'd always thought of these things as burning serpents. Regardless, the bites are killing people. I think that's the main point. That's not up for debate. That's what's happening. That God sends the serpents among them to punish them for acting this way. And the serpent's bites are killing people. So the people come to Moses, and Moses prays for the people. Verse 7. Who they complain against? They complain against God and Moses. But when they're looking for somebody to appeal for them, they appeal to Moses. Moses, please ask for mercy. Please reach out to the Lord for us. Says, we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that He will take away these serpents from us. This is one of those, a pattern that we've seen over and over again. To me, it's an amazing reflection on Moses that he's constantly being put in this position where people are rebelling against him, and then he's the one that ends up having to mediate for them on their behalf. So the very people who have been complaining are now asking him for mercy, for his intercession. We've seen this over and over again. Yes, sir.
God, throughout all the history, always gives us reminders. That's what He's doing here. He's giving us one more reminder.
Yeah.
We see it.
Yeah.
Throughout the time.
Well, the reason that these complaints are so memorable is because God sends punishment immediately. He sends punishment immediately. Like, hey, you want to rebel, earth's going to open up and swallow you. You want to rebel, fire's going to come down from heaven. You want to rebel, serpents are going to come and bite you.
Not always a bad reminder, sometimes a good reminder.
Right. Well, this is, I guess, one thought off of that. This is the chart that I told y'all Rhodes put together, that's from his website. These are the 9 complaints in the wilderness before they get to the promised land the first time. And then this is the back of the sheet where you see the complaints after they try to enter the promised land. This is the one, we're at right here. I guess one thought off of that, Steve, is, we don't see the hand of God this way in our lives. We don't see the hand of God this way in the lives of people around us. And people make jokes about it. People say, well,
We remember.
that's what we've got to do. But, people will say, they'll do something wrong. They know they're doing something wrong, and they'll like, well, I didn't get struck by lightning. I guess we're all right. And they'll like, you're gonna treat this God that way? Do you think that he is just not watching in this moment? Do you think that he doesn't realize? To me, if you just think in your life, like we wouldn't have ever made it. But in our lives, if when you rebelled against the Lord, you were struck dead, how far would you have made it?
There'd be nobody on the planet.
There'd be nobody on the planet. That's my point. There would be nobody on the planet. God can't treat everybody this way, or there would be nobody on the planet. And so what we've got to do is what Steve is talking about, is take these warnings seriously, realize this is the same God. He still cares about being treated as holy. He still wants to be treated as holy. He still wants his word to be held in reverence. He still wants us to honor what he tells us and honor him by caring about what he tells us. When we put aside his commandments, when we rebel against him, when we're ungrateful, that's the one that sticks out to me about, and that's actually where the sermon's going as well. When we're ungrateful, like these people were, it's ugly. It's disgusting. And God obviously hates it. That's what we're seeing. This is how God feels about it. So if we can learn to realize, like Steve is saying, and remind ourselves. Amen. Amen. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so what is the solution here? We've got these serpents going around killing people. What's the solution?
Oh, snake.
Yeah.
For serpent.
Isn't that weird? I mean, hadn't he told them not to make graven images? If you look on this serpent, you will live. It seems very different, from what he'd been asking for. You will make no graven images.
I was going to say, you were talking a minute ago about being struck at the time that you didn't do it, but they saw the rewards as soon as they came to. We don't always see our rewards. I keep thinking about ourselves and how we live. We don't always see our rewards, but the dread of not living life can really be heavy on a person.
For sure.
Just thinking about it.
If we wanted to start speculating, well, why a serpent? Why does he want them to make this? I don't know that I've got a good answer. I do think it's interesting. It's interesting that he asked them to do this. It takes faith, to respond, and that's one thing we point to the story for. Moses does it. He makes this serpent. God tells him when somebody is bitten, if he looks on the serpent, when he sees it, he'll be healed. So those are the instructions. Like with a lot of Bible stories, God gives the instructions, and when people do it, it works. And you could say, well, we don't know. What about the people that didn't look? Well, I don't need a verse to tell me what happened to them. Like if somebody was bitten and they didn't look, I don't need a verse to tell me what happened. If somebody looks, they were healed. If they didn't look, Moses makes this serpent, and I've made this point from this story before, but you can imagine, so Moses is going to make the serpent, and you're in your tent, and you get bitten, and somebody says, hey, all you got to do is go look at that serpent on the pole, and you'll live. And no thanks. Or it's like, yeah, I believe that. Obviously Moses is God's messenger. I believe that, but I'm not going to go look. I'm not going to go look. I'm just going to stay here. It's like, so you either are in a position of, not believing or not caring, or believing it but not believing it enough to act on it. That action doesn't save. That lack of action doesn't save. There's a great parallel. Obviously, you see this in so many Bible stories.
Just how this hurts, or are you collapsed on the ground?
Starting to shut down.
So it may have required them to make some effort
Sure.
to go to see this.
Because the serpent would have only been in one spot.
Right. So maybe it was a matter of, you got to put some effort into this, and you can make it.
Absolutely, yeah. And we don't know the details, but you can imagine people carrying their friends to the serpent, or maybe the serpent was being carried around the camp.
Right.
We don't know those details, but we do know if a person looked, they were healed. And so it's fun thinking, or interesting thinking about how that would have unfolded. Now, one thing we do know, Terry brought this up in his study Wednesday, is that this snake on a pole, became an idol. It became an idol. They were worshiping it as a god. They were worshiping it as an idol. Much later in their history, they started worshiping it as an idol, which was always the warning against making graven images, against making these things, as they become something that is attached greater significance than it should be. And we've got to, I won't take much time, but just think about this for a second. We have a verse, I'm going to quote it today in the lesson. Baptism doth now save us. Baptism doth now save us. We know that just as the Son of Man was lifted up on the pole, just as the serpent was lifted on the pole, so the Son of Man is going to be lifted up, and anybody that looks on him will live. We know that. Jesus makes that parallel. And then we're told baptism saves us. And so we know, we connect these verses, and we know, similar to this story, if a person looked on the serpent, he would be healed. If a person will submit to baptism, he can be healed. He can be made whole. And so because we know that, sometimes we will attach a greater significance to baptism than maybe we should. We start worshiping baptism almost like an idol. It's like, well, we just need to get somebody in the water. We just need to baptize them. It's like, I agree, baptism is essential. But if you're dunking somebody in the water and their heart isn't in it, their heart doesn't understand it, then all you're doing is going through the motions. You can turn God's commands, any of God's commands, you can turn into an idol if you're not careful. Maybe instruments, singing without instruments in worship, singing and making melody in your heart can become an idol if we let it. It's like, well, I don't sing with instruments, so I know God's happy with me. Like, that's great, you're not singing with instruments. I think that's the right way, but are you singing with melody in your heart? Are you singing with spirit and soul? We can follow God's commands in such a way that we turn the commands into idols if we're not careful. So I'll just plant that seed. We can talk some more about that next week if y'all want to. We'll have to stop now. We've got about 10 minutes before our worship begins. Thank you.